The house had never felt this quiet before. Not even in the early mornings, back when the sun would barely touch the edges of the curtains and the world outside still seemed undecided about waking up. Back then, there had always been small sounds, footsteps in the hallway, the hum of the kettle, the familiar rhythm of a family moving through life together. Now, there was only silence. Margaret stood in the kitchen, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the wooden counter her husband had installed nearly 30 years ago. The surface was worn smooth in places, marked by time and use, by countless meals prepared and conversations shared. She traced one of those faint lines absent-mindedly, as if it might lead her back to a moment when things still made sense. From where she stood, she could see the dining room. The table was set. It always was. 6 chairs, though only one had been used regularly for months now. The others remained in place like quiet witnesses, reminders of what the room had once held. Laughter, arguments, the overlapping voices of people who belonged to each other, even when they didn't agree. Margaret exhaled slowly. Family. The word felt heavier than it used to. There had been a time when she believed it meant something unbreakable, something that could stretch, bend, even bruise, but never truly fracture. She had built her life around that belief, poured herself into it, shaped her days, her decisions, her identity around the idea that if she gave enough, loved enough, everything would hold together. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. Not all at once. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, it had happened quietly, subtly, like a shift in the air that you don't notice until it's already too late to name when it began. First, it was the missed calls, then the shortened visits, then the holidays that became too busy this year. Margaret had told herself not to read too much into it. People had lives, responsibilities. Modern families weren't like they used to be. Everyone said that. She had nodded, smiled, agreed. And then slowly, she had begun adjusting. Cooking less, expecting less, speaking less. It was easier that way. Or at least, that's what she had convinced herself. Her gaze drifted to the framed photograph on the far wall. It had been taken years ago, at a time when smiles came naturally and no one hesitated to stand close to one another. Her son stood beside her in the picture, younger, softer around the edges. His arm rested casually on her shoulder, a gesture so simple, so effortless, that it now felt almost foreign. Next to him stood his wife. Perfect posture, perfect smile. Even back then, Margaret remembered thinking there was something distant about her. Not cold, exactly. Not unkind. Just controlled. Measured in a way that made warmth feel optional rather than instinctive. Margaret had ignored that feeling. Of course she had. Because love, she believed, meant making space. It meant welcoming someone new without suspicion, without judgment. It meant trusting that kindness would be returned in time. And for a while, she thought it had been. Or maybe she had only wanted to believe it. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, pulling her back into the present. Tonight was Thanksgiving. The house would not stay quiet for long. Soon, the door would open. Voices would fill the rooms again. Plates would be passed, polite smiles exchanged, and conversations carefully balanced on the surface of things no one wanted to name. Margaret straightened slightly, smoothing her hands over her sweater. She had prepared everything, just as she always did. The turkey, the stuffing, the cranberry sauce in the same glass bowl she had used for decades. Tradition had a way of making things feel stable, even when they weren't. For a brief moment, she allowed herself a small, fragile hope. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe something could still be repaired. Maybe the distance she felt wasn't as wide as it seemed. But deep down, beneath that hope, there was something else. A quiet, growing awareness. Something had shifted in her family. And whatever was waiting for her at that dinner table would not be easy to ignore anymore. The doorbell rang at exactly 4 o'clock. Margaret didn't jump, but her shoulders tightened ever so slightly, the kind of reaction that came not from surprise, but from anticipation. She wiped her hands on a folded kitchen towel, smoothing it carefully before setting it aside, as if even that small act required composure. "Coming," she called, her voice steady. The walk to the front door felt longer than usual. With each step, she became more aware of the silence behind her, the last few seconds of calm before everything shifted. She paused briefly with her hand on the doorknob, inhaled, and then opened it. Her son stood there. Daniel. He looked older than she remembered, though she had seen him just a few weeks ago. Not physically, his posture was still straight, his coat neatly pressed, but there was something in his expression. A distance in his eyes. Like he was already thinking about something else. "Hi, Mom," he said, leaning in for a quick hug. It was brief.
Polite.
Gone before it could mean anything.
I, suart, Margaret raplia sufli.
Behind him, Vanessa stepped forward. Elegant as always. Her coat was a soft cream color, tailored perfectly, her hair styled with effortless precision. She smiled. Bright, practiced, impeccable. "Happy Thanksgiving, Margaret," she said. "Not Mom. Never Mom." Margaret returned the smile. "Happy Thanksgiving."
Come in.
They stepped inside, bringing with them the crisp chill of the late November air. Daniel carried a bottle of wine. Vanessa carried nothing. Margaret noticed. She always noticed. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, closing the door behind them. "Smells amazing," Daniel replied automatically, already glancing down at his phone. Vanessa's eyes moved through the house in a slow, quiet sweep, not admiring, not nostalgic. Assessing. It was subtle, but Margaret felt it. By the time they sat down at the table, the house was no longer quiet, but it wasn't warm either. The sounds filled the space, but they didn't connect. Forks against plates, glasses touching the table. Small, measured conversations that hovered safely above anything real. Daniel spoke about work, something about expansion, new clients, long hours. Margaret nodded in the right places, offering soft responses when needed. Vanessa added details occasionally, her tone smooth, controlled. "Chicago is becoming a key market," she said lightly. "It makes sense for Daniel to focus there more." Margaret smiled. "That sounds busy." "It is," Vanessa replied. "But progress usually is." There was something in the way she said it. Not wrong, just pointed. Margaret reached for the cranberry sauce, placing it gently between them. "Some traditions are worth keeping," she said quietly. Vanessa's lips curved slightly. "Yes," she said. "Some are." Dinner continued like that for a while, balanced, careful, almost rehearsed. Until it wasn't. It happened in a moment so small that, for a second, Margaret almost thought she had imagined it. Daniel had just laughed at something on his phone. Vanessa had set her fork down. The room shifted, just slightly. Then Vanessa leaned back in her chair, glancing around the table with a faint, almost amused expression. "You know," she said casually, "it's interesting." Margaret looked up. "What is?" Vanessa tilted her head, her smile still in place, but thinner now.
Sharper.
"How family dynamics work," she continued, "especially when boundaries aren't really respected." The word boundaries hung in the air. Daniel's smile faded just a fraction. Margaret's fingers tightened around her napkin. "I'm not sure I understand," she said carefully. Vanessa let out a soft, almost polite laugh. "Of course," she replied. "I just mean sometimes people don't realize how overwhelming they can be." Silence. Not the quiet from before. This one had weight. Margaret felt it settle into her chest. "I've always tried to be supportive," she said gently. "I'm sure you have," Vanessa said quickly. Too quickly. Then she leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting Margaret's directly for the first time that evening. "But support can feel like control," she added. The words landed cleanly, deliberately. Daniel shifted in his seat. "Vanessa." But she didn't stop. In fact, her voice softened, which somehow made it worse. "Honestly," she said, her tone almost conversational now, "sometimes it feels like dealing with a difficult mother-in-law stereotype." Margaret blinked. The room seemed to narrow. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Vanessa smiled. Not warmly. Just enough. "You know," she said, lifting her glass as if nothing unusual had happened, "the overbearing kind." A pause. Then lightly, almost carelessly, "The kind people joke about. The toxic mother-in-law." The word toxic echoed in Margaret's ears. No one laughed. No one spoke. Daniel stared at the table, and in that silence, something inside Margaret shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The silence did not break. It stretched. It deepened. It settled into the room like something alive, something no one wanted to touch, but no one could escape. Margaret did not move. Her hands remained folded neatly in her lap, her posture unchanged, her face composed in the same quiet expression she had worn for years. But inside, something was unraveling, slowly, carefully, like a thread being pulled loose after holding everything together for far too long.
Toxic.
The word echoed again, not shouted, not thrown in anger, but placed there, deliberately, casually, like it belonged. Margaret turned her eyes toward Daniel. He was still looking down, not at his plate, not at Vanessa, just down, waiting, avoiding, choosing silence. Her chest tightened, not sharply, not suddenly, but with a dull, familiar ache that had been building for longer than she had allowed herself to admit. "Daniel," she said softly.
Her voice was calm. Too calm.
He hesitated before looking up. "Yeah, Mom?" Just that. No concern. No question. Just acknowledgement. Margaret studied his face, searching for something, anything, that might tell her she had misunderstood, that this moment was somehow smaller than it felt. But there was nothing there, only discomfort and distance. "Do you agree with that?" she asked quietly. The question hung in the air, fragile and dangerous at the same time. Daniel shifted in his seat, exhaling slowly. "It's not like that," he said. Margaret waited. He didn't continue. Vanessa did. "Well," she said smoothly, setting her glass down with careful precision, "it's not exactly like that." Margaret's gaze moved back to her. Vanessa met it easily, confidently. "As I said," she continued, "it's about boundaries." Margaret felt something flicker inside her. Not anger, not yet.
Clarity.
"What boundaries?" she asked. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, as if considering how best to explain something obvious. "Showing up unannounced," she said. "Calling multiple times a day. Offering opinions that weren't asked for." Each phrase was delivered evenly, measured, like items on a list. Margaret blinked. "I called to check on you," she said. "Your family. And we appreciate that," Vanessa replied quickly. Again, too quickly. But appreciation doesn't mean comfort. The words were sharp now, even if the tone wasn't. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Mom, it's just things are different now," he added. "We have our own routine." Margaret looked at him. "Our own routine." She repeated the phrase silently, letting it settle. "I didn't realize I was disrupting it," she said. Vanessa gave a small, polite smile. "That's kind of the point," she said. For a moment, no one spoke again. The food on the table had gone untouched. Steam no longer rose from the dishes. The warmth Margaret had spent hours creating had quietly faded into something else entirely. She became aware of her breathing. Slow, controlled. The way she had learned to breathe in moments when emotions threatened to surface in ways she had always believed were unnecessary, unhelpful, unwanted. Because for years, Margaret had told herself something very simple. Peace was more important than being right. Harmony was more important than being heard. And silence was often the price of both. She had paid that price willingly, again and again. But sitting there now, in the middle of her own dining room, listening to herself being reduced to a stereotype, to a problem that needed managing, something inside her began to shift. Not loudly, not visibly, but fundamentally. She looked at Vanessa, then at Daniel, then at the table she had set with such care. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't rush to fix the moment, didn't soften it, didn't apologize for something she didn't fully understand. Instead, she simply sat with it, with the discomfort, with the truth, whatever it was. And in that stillness, a quiet realization began to take shape. Maybe the silence she had protected for so long was never really peace. Margaret did not remember standing up. One moment, she was sitting at the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her heart beating in that slow, controlled rhythm she had trained it to follow. And the next, she was in the kitchen. The movement had been quiet, almost invisible, the kind of motion that doesn't interrupt a room, doesn't demand attention. No one called after her. No one asked if she was all right. Behind her, she could still hear the faint clink of silverware, the low murmur of voices resuming, carefully stepping around what had just happened, as if it were something best left undisturbed. Margaret stood by the sink, staring down at her hands. They were steady. That surprised her. For years, she had imagined that if a moment like this ever came, if she were ever confronted, openly dismissed, quietly replaced, she would feel something explosive. Anger.
Hurt.
Something undeniable. But what she felt now was different. Stillness. A deep, unsettling clarity. She reached for the edge of the counter, her fingers pressing lightly against the familiar wood. The same counter she had leaned on through decades of life, raising a child, caring for a husband, building a home out of routines and small, steady acts of love. 40 years. 40 years of showing up. And somehow, it had led here. Her reflection caught faintly in the darkened kitchen window. For a moment, she studied it. The soft lines around her eyes. The silver woven into her hair. The expression she had worn for so long that she barely recognized it anymore. Gentle, accommodating, endlessly patient. Safe. That was the word people used. Margaret is so easy to be around. Margaret never makes things difficult. Margaret understands. She had built her identity on that. On being the one who adjusted. The one who absorbed. The one who made space for everyone else, even when it meant shrinking herself in ways no one ever noticed. At first it had felt like love. Then it had become habit. And somewhere along the way, it had turned into permission. Permission for others to decide how much of her mattered. Permission for her presence to be optional. For her voice to be negotiable. She closed her eyes briefly. A memory surfaced. Unexpected, vivid. Daniel as a child. 6 years old, standing in this very kitchen, holding onto the edge of her sweater with small, determined fingers. "Mom, don't go," he had said once, when she tried to leave for work early. She had knelt down, smoothing his hair, smiling gently. "I'll always come back," she had promised. And she had meant it. Every single time. No matter how tired she was. No matter how much of herself she had to leave behind in other places. She had always come back. Margaret opened her eyes again. The woman in the reflection looked the same. But something behind her eyes had changed. "I stayed," she whispered softly. Not to anyone else. To herself. "I stayed through everything." The words were not bitter. They were not angry. They were true. And for the first time, she let that truth exist without softening it, without immediately following it with justification or excuse. She had stayed. She had given. She had endured. And yet, it had not protected her from being reduced to a problem, to a label, to something that needed boundaries. From the dining room, Vanessa's voice drifted in again, light, controlled, as if nothing of consequence had occurred. Margaret listened. Really listened. Not to the words, but to the tone. The certainty. The ease. And suddenly, something became unmistakably clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a bad moment. This was a pattern. One she had been stepping around for years. One she had chosen not to name. Margaret straightened slowly. Her hands left the counter. Her shoulders lifted, not stiffly, not defensively, but with a quiet, deliberate awareness. For the first time in a long time, she did not feel small in her own home. She felt present. And with that presence came a question she had never truly allowed herself to ask. What if peace was never meant to cost this much? The thought lingered. Not loud, not urgent, but steady. And once it formed, it did not leave. Margaret did not return to the table right away. Instead, she reached for the kettle. It was already full. She had prepared everything earlier, as she always did, but she switched it on anyway. The soft click, followed by the low hum of heating water, filled the kitchen with a quiet, steady sound. Something predictable, something she could control. For a moment, she simply stood there listening to it. And then, without planning to, she spoke again, softly, but this time with intention. No more. The words barely rose above a whisper, but they landed inside her. She turned slightly, resting her hands against the counter, and let the thought expand. No more adjusting every sentence before speaking. No more pretending not to notice what was clearly there. No more shrinking herself to make others comfortable. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with relief. A strange, unfamiliar lightness, as if something she had been carrying for years had quietly slipped from her shoulders without her noticing when it happened. Margaret inhaled slowly. For so long, she believed that being a good mother, being a good person, meant enduring. It meant patience, understanding, sacrifice. And she had done all of those things, willingly. But no one had ever told her where the line was. No one had said, this is where love ends and self-abandonment begins. So she had kept going, further, quieter, smaller, until there was almost nothing left of her that wasn't shaped by someone else's needs. The kettle clicked off. Margaret reached for a cup, her movements calm, deliberate. She poured the water slowly, watching the steam rise into the air and disappear. For a brief moment, she thought about returning to the table the way she always had, gentle smile, soft tone, smoothing over the edges of what had just happened. She could do it. She knew exactly how. A small apology, a careful redirection of conversation, a quiet dismissal of her own feelings. It would restore the surface. It always did. But this time, she didn't move, because now she understood something she hadn't allowed herself to see before. Every time she restored the surface, she erased herself a little more. Margaret set the cup down. Her fingers lingered on the edge for just a second. Then she turned, not toward the table, toward the doorway. And she stood there, looking in. Daniel was speaking again, his voice low, measured. Vanessa sat across from him, composed, engaged, as if the conversation from earlier had been nothing more than a minor interruption. They looked comfortable, unaffected, and that, more than anything, settled something inside her. This wasn't painful for them, only for her. And suddenly, that felt unacceptable. Margaret stepped forward. The sound of her footsteps was soft, but this time, it didn't go unnoticed. Daniel glanced up first. "Mom," he said. Vanessa followed, her expression neutral but attentive. Margaret stopped at the edge of the table. For a moment, she simply looked at them, not searching, not questioning.
Seeing.
Really seeing. And then calmly, clearly she spoke. "I think we need to change a few things." The words hung in the air, different from before. Not defensive, not emotional, just firm. Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Margaret met his eyes. "I mean," she said gently, "I won't be coming over unannounced anymore." A pause. "I won't call unless it's necessary." Another pause. "And I won't involve myself in your lives unless I'm invited." Vanessa's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Daniel blinked. "That's not what we—" "It's what you asked for," Margaret said quietly. Not sharply, not accusingly, just accurately. Silence followed. But this silence felt different. It didn't press down on her. It didn't ask her to fill it. For the first time in years, it belonged to her. Margaret took a slow breath. And in return, she added softly, "I expect the same respect." Her gaze moved briefly to Vanessa. Clear communication, honesty, and no more labels. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, as if preparing to respond, but no words came, because there was nothing to soften, nothing to reinterpret. Margaret had said exactly what she meant. She reached for her cup of tea, her hand steady, and as she stood there, in the center of the room she had built, in the life she had held together for decades, she realized something quietly powerful. This wasn't the end of peace. This was the beginning of it. Daniel was the first to react. Not with words, with movement. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his brows pulling together in a way Margaret hadn't seen since he was younger, when something unsettled him, but he didn't yet know how to name it. "Mom, you don't have to do that," he said. His voice wasn't harsh, but it wasn't supportive either. It hovered somewhere in between, uncertain, uncomfortable. Margaret held her cup gently, letting the warmth settle into her palms. "I know I don't have to," she replied. A small pause. "I'm choosing to." The distinction was quiet, but it changed everything. Vanessa was watching her closely now, not with open hostility, with calculation, as if she were reassessing something, adjusting to a version of Margaret she hadn't quite accounted for. "That seems a bit extreme," Vanessa said finally, her tone still smooth, but tighter than before. Margaret met her gaze. "Does it?" she asked softly. Vanessa folded her hands together on the table. "We were just asking for space," she said, "not distance." Margaret nodded slowly. "And I'm giving you exactly that." Her voice didn't rise,
Didn't sharpen.
but there was no softness to retreat into anymore. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't what we meant," he said again, more firmly this time. "You're taking it the wrong way." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Then help me understand the right way," she said. The question landed directly.
No escape.
Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it, because for the first time there was no easy answer. No way to smooth it over, without confronting what had actually been said. Margaret watched him carefully, not with disappointment, not even with hurt, with clarity. "You said I was overwhelming," she continued gently, "that my presence felt like control." Her eyes flickered briefly to Vanessa, "and that I fit a certain stereotype." The word hung there again, but this time, it didn't echo. It settled.
Owned.
"And now," she added, "I'm adjusting my behavior accordingly." Vanessa shifted in her seat. Something in her composure cracked, just slightly. "That's not what I said," she replied. Margaret didn't argue. She simply held her gaze. "You called me toxic," she said quietly.
No accusation.
Just truth. The room fell still again. But this silence was different from before. It didn't protect anyone. It revealed them. Daniel looked between the two women, his jaw tightening. "Okay," he said finally. "This is getting blown out of proportion." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She took a small sip of her tea instead, letting the moment breathe. Then she set the cup down.
Carefully.
"Daniel," she said, her voice softer now, but not weaker. "Nothing about this feels exaggerated to me." He didn't answer, because he couldn't dismiss it so easily anymore. Margaret stepped back slightly from the table, not retreating, repositioning. "For years," she continued, "I've tried to make things easier, quieter, more comfortable for everyone." Her hands rested loosely at her sides. "I thought that was what kept a family together." A small pause. "But now I see, it only made me invisible." The words landed gently, but they carried weight. Vanessa's expression hardened, just a fraction. "That's not fair," she said. Margaret gave a small, almost sad smile. "It's honest." Another silence followed, but this time, neither of them rushed to fill it, because something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone.
Not tonight.
Not with a polite change of subject. Margaret reached for the edge of the chair behind her, her fingers resting lightly on the wood. "I'm not angry," she said, and it was true. "I'm just done misunderstanding my place in this family." Daniel flinched slightly at that. "Mom, I'm still your mother," she added gently. Her eyes softened when she looked at him. "That doesn't change." Then her gaze steadied. "But what that means will." She straightened. Not dramatically, just enough. And in that small, deliberate movement, the balance in the room shifted. Not loudly, not forcefully, but permanently. For the first time, Margaret wasn't reacting to the situation. She was defining it. And whether they were ready or not, they would have to meet her there. Vanessa was the first to break. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that revealed far more than raised voices ever could. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms slowly, her polished composure tightening into something sharper, something less controlled. "Well," she said, letting out a small, breathy laugh, "this is unexpected." Margaret didn't respond. She simply watched. And for the first time, she wasn't trying to interpret Vanessa's tone, soften her words, or search for hidden meaning. She saw it clearly now. The shift. The resistance. "I didn't realize setting boundaries would turn into a speech," Vanessa continued, her voice light but edged. "Especially on a holiday." Daniel glanced at her. "Vanessa." "No, it's fine," she said, lifting a hand slightly, cutting him off without looking at him. Her eyes stayed on Margaret. "If this is how you want to handle things, we can be honest." The word honest landed with intention. Margaret felt it, but didn't flinch. "I think we should be," she replied calmly. Vanessa smiled. Not politely this time. Knowingly. "All right then," Vanessa said, leaning forward slightly. "Let's be clear." Her voice dropped, quieter but firmer. "This hasn't been working for a long time." Daniel shifted again. "Vanessa, that's not." "It's true," she said, sharper now. And this time she didn't stop. "You insert yourself into decisions that aren't yours. You expect access to our lives like nothing has changed. And when we try to create space, you act like we're pushing you away." Each sentence came faster, more direct, less filtered. Margaret listened, really listened, and something surprising happened. She didn't feel attacked. She felt confirmed. "I've adjusted my expectations," Margaret said quietly. Vanessa let out another short laugh. "After years," she replied. "Yes," Margaret said.
No defensiveness. No apology.
Just truth. Daniel stood up suddenly, his chair scraping lightly against the floor. "Okay, enough," he said. "This isn't productive." His voice carried tension now, frustration layered over something deeper. Uncertainty. He looked at Margaret, then at Vanessa, caught between them. "Can we just reset?" he added, running a hand through his hair again. "It's Thanksgiving." Margaret held his gaze. "This didn't start tonight," she said gently. Vanessa nodded immediately. Exactly. The agreement landed awkwardly, because for the first time, they were aligned, just not in the way anyone expected. Daniel looked between them again, confusion flickering across his face. "That's not helping," he muttered. But no one corrected him, because the truth didn't need help anymore. It was already there. Vanessa uncrossed her arms slowly, her posture shifting again, less defensive now, more strategic. "If we're being honest," she said, her tone smoothing out once more, "this change you're talking about." She gestured lightly toward Margaret. "It's new." Margaret nodded. "Yes." "And sudden," Vanessa added. "Only from your perspective," Margaret replied. That made Vanessa pause. Just for a second. Because there was no edge in Margaret's voice. No emotion to push against. Only steadiness. And steadiness is difficult to manipulate. "I think," Vanessa said carefully, choosing her words now, "you're reacting emotionally." Margaret almost smiled. "I'm reacting clearly," she said. Another silence. But this one didn't feel tense. It felt exposed. Like everything that had been unspoken for years was finally standing in the room, visible to everyone. Daniel exhaled sharply. "So what happens now?" he asked. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but Margaret answered. "Now," she said softly, "we stop pretending this is something it's not." She glanced briefly at Vanessa, then back at her son. "And we see what's actually here." No one spoke after that, because for the first time, there was nowhere left to hide. Daniel didn't sit back down. He stayed where he was, standing beside his chair, one hand resting against the table as if he needed something solid to hold on to. His eyes moved between Margaret and Vanessa again, but this time, there was something different in the way he looked. Less automatic, less certain. For the first time that evening, he was actually thinking. Vanessa noticed it. Margaret did too. But neither of them said anything. Because this moment didn't need words. It needed space. "Daniel," Vanessa said softly, her tone shifting again, gentler now, more familiar. "You know what I'm talking about." She turned slightly toward him, her voice lowering just enough to feel personal. We've had this conversation before. Margaret watched carefully. Not at Vanessa. At her son. At the subtle change in his posture. The hesitation. The way his shoulders didn't immediately relax like they usually did when Vanessa spoke this way. Daniel started then stopped. He frowned slightly, as if something wasn't aligning the way it normally did. We've talked about needing space, he said slowly. Yes, Vanessa replied quickly. And boundaries, he added. Exactly. Her voice was smooth again. Confident. Reclaiming ground. But Daniel didn't nod right away. His gaze drifted, just briefly, to Margaret. She didn't look away. She didn't soften her expression. She didn't step in to help him resolve the tension. She simply stood there, present. And that was new. Daniel swallowed. Yeah, he said, but it came out quieter this time. Less certain. Vanessa's eyes flickered. Just for a second. Because she heard it too.
Margaret spoke then.
Not to interrupt, but to anchor the moment. Daniel, she said gently, when did I last come by unannounced? The question was simple, specific, impossible to deflect. Daniel blinked. A few weeks ago, I think. Margaret tilted her head slightly. That was your birthday, she said. You asked me to come. A pause. Daniel's brow furrowed. Right, he admitted. Margaret continued, her tone still calm. And the calls, how many did I make this week? Daniel hesitated. He glanced at Vanessa, then back at Margaret. 2, he said. Want to check on you after your trip, Margaret added. And one to ask if you'd like me to bring anything tonight. Silence. Vanessa shifted in her seat. That's not the point, she said quickly. But her voice had lost something. Precision. Margaret didn't look at her. She kept her eyes on Daniel. What I need you to understand, she said softly, is not how you feel in general. A small pause. But what is actually happening? Daniel exhaled slowly. His grip on the table loosened. And something in his expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough to show that a crack had formed in the certainty he had been standing on. I didn't think about it like that, he admitted. Vanessa straightened immediately. Because it's not about counting calls, she said, sharper now. It's about how it feels. Margaret nodded once. That's fair, she said. Then she added gently, but feelings can be influenced. That landed. Harder than anything she had said before. Daniel looked at Vanessa. Really looked at her. And for the first time that evening, there was a question in his eyes. Not directed at Margaret. At his wife. Vanessa saw it. And for the first time, her composure faltered in a way she couldn't immediately recover from. Are you seriously? She started, her voice tightening. But she stopped herself. Too late. The shift had already happened. Margaret didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't push further. Because she didn't need to. The room had changed. Not because of something loud, but because of something quiet. A single moment of doubt. A single moment where Daniel stopped repeating and started noticing. And once that kind of awareness begins, it doesn't disappear. It grows. Vanessa recovered quickly. She always did. The brief crack in her composure smoothed over almost instantly, like a surface tension pulling itself back into place. You're twisting this, she said, her voice controlled again, but firmer now, less polished. This isn't about facts and numbers. It's about patterns. Margaret didn't interrupt. Daniel didn't either. Because now, finally, he was listening differently. What patterns? Daniel asked. The question came out before he could stop it. Vanessa turned to him, surprised. What do you mean? I mean, he hesitated, then continued, slower this time. What exactly has she done recently that feels like that? The word recently lingered. It mattered. Vanessa's lips parted, then closed, because recently was not a word she had prepared for. Well, it's not just about recently, she said. It's everything over time. Daniel nodded faintly. Okay, but give me something specific. The room held its breath. Margaret said nothing. She didn't need to defend herself anymore. The burden of explanation had shifted. Vanessa leaned back slightly, her fingers tightening together in her lap. It's the way she inserts herself, she said. Daniel waited. In what way? He asked. Another pause. Margaret could see it clearly now. Not just what Vanessa was saying, but what she couldn't say. The lack of detail. The absence of something concrete. And more importantly, Daniel saw it too. She always has opinions, Vanessa added quickly. Daniel frowned slightly. About what? About things, Vanessa said, her voice thinning just a little. Like, he pressed. Silence. Real silence. Not avoidance. Exposure. Vanessa exhaled sharply. You're putting me on the spot, she said. Daniel didn't back down. I'm trying to understand. Margaret felt something settle deeper inside her. Not satisfaction. Not victory. Just truth, rising to the surface on its own. She makes me feel like I'm being judged, Vanessa said finally. There it was. Not an action. A feeling. Daniel absorbed that. Slowly. Okay, he said. But that's different from what you said earlier. Vanessa's eyes flashed. How is it different? You said she was controlling, he replied. That she was crossing boundaries. A small pause. This sounds like something else. Vanessa's posture stiffened. Are you taking her side? She asked. The question came quickly. Too quickly. Daniel blinked. No. I'm just trying to figure out what's actually happening. But even as he said it, something had already shifted, because for the first time, he wasn't defaulting to her. Margaret remained still, quiet, but no longer invisible. Vanessa laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. Of course, she said. Now I'm the problem. No one said that, Daniel replied. You didn't have to. The tension in the room tightened again, but this time, it moved differently. Not toward Margaret. Around her. Past her. Margaret watched her son. Really watched him. The way he stood there, caught between two realities. The one he had been told, and the one he was beginning to see. Daniel, she said gently. He looked at her immediately. Not out of habit. Out of attention. You don't have to choose a side, she said. A small pause. You just have to see clearly. The words landed quietly, but they stayed. Vanessa looked at Margaret then. Really looked at her. And for the first time that evening, there was no control in her expression. Only something sharper. Something unsettled. Because the dynamic she had relied on was no longer stable. And she knew it. Daniel exhaled slowly. His gaze dropped for a moment, then lifted again. Not uncertain this time. Not defensive, but thoughtful, measured, awake. I think, he started, then paused, choosing his words carefully. I think there are things we haven't been honest about. Vanessa's expression hardened. Excuse me? But Daniel didn't look at her. Not yet. He was still looking at the space between them, at everything that had just surfaced. Margaret didn't move, didn't speak, because she understood something now. This part of the truth was no longer hers to carry. Daniel finally looked at Vanessa, not briefly, not cautiously, fully, and that alone changed the air in the room. What do you mean? Vanessa asked, her voice tightening despite her effort to keep it even. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be sorting through something, pieces that no longer fit together the way they used to. For a while now, he said slowly, I've been going along with things because I thought it made sense. Vanessa's expression didn't move, but her eyes sharpened. What things? Daniel exhaled. The idea that Mom was too involved, he said. That she was overstepping. A pause. That she was the problem. Silence. Margaret didn't react, but she felt it. Not as pain. Not anymore. As recognition. Vanessa let out a small, disbelieving laugh. You agreed with that, she said. Daniel nodded once. I did. Then he added. But I never really questioned why. That landed. Hard. Vanessa straightened. So now you're questioning it? She asked. Daniel hesitated. Then, yes. The word hung in the air like a line drawn across the room. Clear. Unavoidable. Margaret watched quietly, because this moment didn't belong to her. It never had. What exactly are you questioning? Vanessa pressed, her tone no longer soft. Daniel looked at her. Everything we've been saying, he replied. A small pause. And everything we haven't. Vanessa shook her head slightly. This is ridiculous. But there was a crack in her voice now. Not large, but real. No, Daniel said, more firmly this time. What's ridiculous is that I never stopped to check if what we were saying was actually true. He gestured lightly toward the table. We keep talking about patterns, about control, about boundaries. His eyes met hers. But when I try to point to something real, there's nothing clear there. Vanessa's composure faltered again. You're oversimplifying it, she said. Then help me understand it, Daniel replied. Another pause. But this time, Vanessa didn't fill it. Because she couldn't. Not in the way she used to. Margaret could feel the shift fully now. Not just in the words. In the structure of the room itself. The balance had changed. The direction of pressure. The center of gravity. This isn't about her actions, Daniel continued, quieter now. It's about how you feel. Vanessa's eyes flashed. And that doesn't matter? It does, he said quickly. Then, more carefully. But it's not the same thing. That distinction settled heavily between them. Vanessa looked at him as if seeing him differently. Not as someone aligned with her, but as someone stepping away. You're defending her, she said. Daniel shook his head. I'm trying to be fair. Margaret lowered her gaze slightly. Not to withdraw, but to absorb. Because for the first time in years, someone was speaking in her presence, without speaking over her. Vanessa stood up abruptly. Her chair slid back sharply against the floor. I can't believe this, she said. The calm was gone now, replaced by something more raw, more exposed. Daniel didn't move. Vanessa. No, she cut in. You don't get to turn this around on me. I'm not. You are, she said. You're making it sound like I invented all of this. Daniel's voice dropped. Did you? The question hit harder than anything else that had been said, because it didn't accuse. It asked. Vanessa stared at him for a long moment, too long. And in that silence, the answer began to take shape on its own. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, not out of exhaustion, but out of understanding. This was it, the moment everything shifted from assumption to truth. And truth, once spoken, or even almost spoken, could not be taken back. Vanessa didn't answer. Not right away. For the first time since the conversation began, she had nothing immediate to say, no smooth transition, no carefully chosen phrasing to redirect the moment. She just stood there, still, silent. And that silence said more than anything she could have. Daniel noticed it. Margaret did too. But this time, neither of them rushed to fill the space. Because now the silence was doing the work. I didn't invent anything, Vanessa said finally. Her voice was quieter, less certain, but still holding on. I just saw things clearly. Daniel watched her. Then help me see them the same way, he said. There was no challenge in his tone. No accusation. Just a simple request. Vanessa shook her head slightly. You wouldn't understand, she said. And that, more than anything else, shifted something in Daniel. Try me, he replied. A pause. Then another. Vanessa's expression tightened. This isn't about one specific thing, she said. It's about how she is. Margaret remained still. But inside, she recognized it immediately. That phrase. That framing. Not actions. Not facts. Identity. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? He asked. Vanessa exhaled, clearly frustrated now. It means she has a way of making everything feel like it revolves around her, she said. Margaret's eyes lifted slightly. Daniel's followed. Everything, he repeated. Vanessa hesitated again. Because now, every word had weight. Every claim needed shape. And there was very little left to stand on. She makes me feel like I'm always being evaluated, Vanessa added. Daniel nodded slowly. You said that before. Yes, she replied quickly. Because it's true. Daniel considered that. Then, carefully. That's how you feel, he said. Vanessa's jaw tightened. That matters. It does, he agreed. Then he added, but it doesn't mean she's actually doing something wrong. That was it. The line. The one Vanessa hadn't expected him to draw. You're minimizing this, she said, her voice rising slightly. I'm clarifying it, Daniel replied. Margaret watched them, not as someone caught in the middle, but as someone finally outside of it. Vanessa turned toward her suddenly. This is exactly what I mean, she said. You just stand there, quiet, composed, and somehow everything shifts around you. Margaret met her gaze. Yes, she said. A small pause. I stopped trying to control how you see me. Vanessa blinked, caught off guard. For years, Margaret continued gently, I tried to adjust myself so you would feel comfortable. Her voice remained calm, even. But comfort built on misunderstanding doesn't last. Daniel looked at his mother, really looked at her, and something inside him settled into place. I think, he said slowly, we've been operating on assumptions. Vanessa let out a sharp breath. We haven't been assuming. We've been dealing with reality. Daniel shook his head. No, he said quietly. We've been dealing with interpretations. That distinction landed deep. Vanessa's shoulders stiffened. So now I'm wrong, she asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He took a step back, not away from her, but into his own space. I think, he said carefully, we need to separate what's actually happened from what we've told ourselves it means. Silence again, but this time, it didn't feel like tension. It felt like exposure, like everything had been laid out on the table and could no longer be rearranged into something easier. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to acknowledge something quietly profound. She was no longer being defined in that room. She was no longer defending her existence in her own family. And whatever came next would be built on something real, not silence, not assumption, not control, but truth. Daniel didn't speak for a long time. No one did. The room, once filled with tension and layered voices, had settled into something quieter, something steadier. Not comfortable, not yet, but real. Vanessa remained standing, her arms now at her sides instead of crossed. The sharpness in her posture had softened, not into surrender, but into uncertainty. And uncertainty was new. I don't think this can go back to the way it was, Daniel said finally.
His voice was calm.
Not defensive, not reactive.
Certain.
Vanessa looked at him. What does that mean? She asked, though something in her expression suggested she already knew. Daniel took a slow breath. It means we need to rebuild this, he said. From something honest. A pause. And that might not look the way we expected. Margaret stood quietly, her hands resting loosely around her cup. She didn't step forward, didn't step back. She stayed exactly where she was. Present.
Whole.
Vanessa's gaze shifted, first to Daniel, then to Margaret. For a moment, there was something vulnerable in her eyes. Not weakness, but exposure. Like someone who had just realized the ground beneath them was not as solid as they believed. I never meant to, Vanessa began, then stopped. The sentence didn't finish, because maybe she didn't fully understand her own intentions anymore. Margaret didn't rush to fill it. She didn't offer reassurance, didn't soften the moment, because for the first time, it wasn't her responsibility to make this easier. What happens now? Vanessa asked quietly. Not to Daniel. Not entirely to Margaret, but into the space between them. Margaret answered, not quickly, but clearly. Now, she said, we move forward with honesty. A small pause, and distance where it's needed. Vanessa nodded faintly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Daniel looked at his mother. There was something in his eyes Margaret hadn't seen in a long time. Not guilt, not obligation, recognition. I should have paid more attention, he said. Margaret met his gaze. You're paying attention now, she replied gently. And that was enough. Another silence followed, but this one was different from all the others. It didn't carry tension. It didn't ask to be resolved. It simply existed. Margaret set her cup down. The soft sound of porcelain against wood echoed lightly in the room. "I think it's time to end dinner," she said calmly. No one argued. Daniel nodded. Vanessa stepped back slightly, giving space without being asked. They gathered their things quietly. No forced smiles.
No empty reassurances.
Just a shared understanding that something significant had shifted, and that it would take time to understand what came next. At the door, Daniel hesitated. "Mom," he said. Margaret turned. "I'll call you," he added. Not automatically. Not out of habit. With intention. Margaret gave a small nod. "I'll answer," she said. Vanessa met her eyes one last time. There were no words, but there was no dismissal either. Only something uncertain. Unfinished. When the door closed, the house returned to silence. But it was no longer the same silence as before. Margaret stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she walked slowly back into the dining room. The table was still set. Half-eaten food. Unfinished glasses. A scene paused in the middle of something that could not be undone. She began clearing the plates. Not hurriedly. Not heavily. Just steadily. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was cleaning up after something broken. She felt like she was making space. Space for something new. Something honest. Something that did not require her to disappear in order to exist. Margaret paused, her hand resting lightly on the back of one of the empty chairs. She looked around the room, at the life she had built, at the place where she had given so much of herself. And for the first time, she didn't feel small inside it. She felt at home. Not because everything was perfect, but because she had finally chosen herself within it. And that, more than anything, changed everything.